You sheltered her?" The chief's voice was a whisper and a warning. The next morning, 70 warriors surrounded Sam's cabin without a word. What began as an act of kindness now teetered on the edge of war and love. Welcome to MS Incredible Stories. Let's uncover what really happened. Sam Ward stood by the window of his weathered cabin, the fading light of dusk casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. His rough hands rested on the sill, knuckles white against the cold wood. 45 years had settled deep into his frame, his beard streaked with gray, his eyes heavy with unspoken grief. The wind whispered softly outside, carrying the scent of pine and distant smoke. But inside, the silence was thick, almost suffocating. It had been 3 years since Marjorie, his wife, passed beneath the leaning cottonwood by the creek, and the weight of her absence still pressed on him like a stone tied to his chest. The cabin bore traces of a life paused. A woven shawl, once hers, hung draped over a chair he never sat in. Shelves lined with jars of dried herbs stood untouched, a quiet testament to hands that no longer tended them. Sam's bed was made on one side only, the other half empty and cold, a space where loss had taken root. His daughter had never breathed life into the world, a silence before birth that left no cradle to rock, no lullaby to hum. Outside, the prairie stretched endless and wild, the sky bruised purple and red as the sun slipped behind distant hills. Sam's eyes traced the barren horizon, searching for something he could not name. The town knew him only as the taciturn rancher who arrived once a month to trade and vanish again, a man too wrapped in his own sorrow to speak beyond necessity. A sudden noise broke the stillness, a faint, uneven sound, halting and unsure, like the careful step of an animal. Som is Gauze Sharpant. He reached for the shotgun, leaning by the door, the motion automatic, more out of habit than threat. The air had turned colder, the wind shifting to carry the subtle scent of smoke and earth. He stepped outside, boots crunching on the frostbitten ground, eyes scanning the shadowed edges of his land. Near the barn, beneath the cedar tree, he saw her, a figure curled in the snow, pale and fragile, like a wounded deer left to the mercy of winter. The fading light caught the glint of blood on torn fabric, and for a moment, Sam simply watched, the silence between them heavier than words. The girl lay curled beneath the cedar tree, her body small and fragile against the harsh snow. Her breath was shallow, a faint rasp that seemed to struggle against the cold air. Sam knelt beside her, careful not to startle, his shotgun forgotten at the edge of the barn. Her dark hair was tangled with frost, strands clinging to the blood staining her torn sleeve. Despite the frozen earth beneath her, she seemed weightless, like a whisper caught between life and death. He reached out slowly, lifting her with surprising gentleness. Her limbs were limp but not lifeless, and she didn't resist. Carrying her into the cabin felt like crossing a threshold into another world, one where silence held more meaning than words. He laid her by the hearth, where the warmth fought back the cold that had seeped into her bones. Wrapped in a threadbare blanket, she stirred faintly, eyes fluttering open to reveal a gaze clouded with fear and pain. Her lips moved in a language Sam didn't know, the sound soft and unfamiliar, like a secret whispered long ago. Comanche, maybe. He remembered tales of the tribes who once roamed these lands before the soldiers came and forced them away. She was young, no more than 20, and carried the look of someone running from shadows far darker than the winter night. Sam fetched a basin of warm water and began washing the blood from her arm, revealing a deep but clean cut. He worked with the practiced hands of a man who had once been a medic, years before grief and isolation claimed him. The girl flinched only once, eyes squeezing shut as the needle pierced her skin to stitch the wound closed. Neither spoke. Words felt unnecessary in the quiet urgency of healing. When the task was done, Sam stepped outside to wash his hands in the cold night air, letting the sharp wind clear the heaviness from his lungs. The moon hung low, pale and steady, casting silver light over the prairie. Inside, the girl settled near the fire, her breathing still shallow but steady. Sam didn't watch her. Instead, he sat in the doorway, listening to the crackle of flames and the whisper of wind, wondering how this fragile stranger had come to him, and what storm she had brought with her. The dawn crept slowly over the snow-covered prairie, pale light filtering through frost-coated windows. Inside the cabin, the girl stirred, her dark eyes opening wide to the unfamiliar warmth around her. She sat upright by the fire, the flickering flames casting shadows across her face, sharp, wary, yet somehow resilient. On the small wooden table beside her lay a modest plate with cornbread and jerky, untouched but within reach. Sam moved quietly, tending to the few chores the morning demanded. He checked the fences, his breath steaming in the cold air. The steady rhythm of his work a quiet contrast to the storm that seemed to gather beyond the horizon. When he returned, he found the hearth swept clean, the blanket folded neatly where it had been tossed the night before. The girl's careful movements revealed a discipline born of survival, not the idle ease of safety. Neither spoke much, the silence between them thick with unasked questions and cautious truce. Hunger etched faint lines on her face, but she ate slowly, deliberately, as if measuring each bite against some unseen clock. Sam watched the way she chewed on one side of her mouth, catching the shadow of a bruise hidden beneath dark skin. He didn't ask how she'd been hurt. She didn't offer an explanation. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the eaves and carrying the scent of distant pine. The sky darkened, heavy with the promise of snow. Sam stoked the fire again, the crackle, and popped a small rebellion against the encroaching cold. He pushed back memories of the wife he had lost, the daughter who never came to be, and focused on the living breath beside him. When night fell fully, the storm broke, whipping against the cabin walls with relentless force. Sam offered the bed to the girl without hesitation, though he himself would sleep in the chair near the fire. It wasn't kindness, he told himself, but practicality. She needed rest, healing. The bed was warmer. She was his responsibility now, a shelter from the storm that was as much outside as it was within. The night settled deep and cold around the cabin, the wind howling like a mournful song against the wooden walls. Inside, the fire flickered low, casting long shadows that danced across the rough-hewn beams. The girl lay in the bed, still and pale, her breathing shallow but steady. Sam sat nearby in the worn chair, hands resting on his knees, eyes tired yet watchful. He remembered the gash on her arm, the clean but deep cut that had drained her strength. His fingers traced the careful stitches he had sewn earlier, the needlework slow and steady, an echo of a past life when healing was more than just survival. The wound was a silent scar, one that spoke of violence and escape, but neither of them spoke of it aloud. Words were heavy and fragile here, better left unspoken. Outside, the storm raged on, snow piling thick against the cabin walls, muffling the world into white silence. The wind's fury was a harsh contrast to the quiet inside, where healing unfolded in stillness. Sam tended the fire, adding wood with deliberate care, watching the flames swallow the night's cold. The scent of pine and smoke mingled with the faint, earthy odor of blood and sweat. The girl's eyes opened once, dark and alert despite her weakness. She looked at Sam without fear, but with a wary understanding. He met her gaze and nodded slightly. No words needed, only the shared acknowledgement of their fragile truce. She turned her head slowly, watching the firelight flicker across the cabin walls. Sam reached quietly for a cup of water and held it to her lips. She drank with slow caution, the moisture bringing a slight flush to her pale face. In that moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, the space between them softened by unspoken trust. Neither belonged here fully. Not yet, but in this small cabin, beneath the weight of loss and danger, something fragile was beginning to take root. The night deepened, but the quiet healing had begun. The morning light filtered weakly through the frosted windows, painting the cabin in muted tones of gray and amber. Sam sat at the worn wooden table, a cup of black coffee cradled in his hands. The silence between sips was thick, filled with memories he carried like old scars beneath his skin. The past was a weight he bore alone, a slow, unrelenting pressure that shaped his every movement. His eyes drifted to the empty side of the bed, where Marjorie's shawl still hung on the chair, a silent witness to years gone by. He remembered her laughter like a distant song, soft and fleeting, and the cradle he never built for the daughter who never took her first breath. Those ghosts clung tightly, whispering in the quiet moments, reminding him of all that was lost. Outside, the prairie stretched vast and unchanging, but inside, the walls held stories no one else could see. Sam's hands, rough and callous from years of work, trembled slightly as he reached for a leather-bound journal, pages filled with sketches of horses, maps, and fragments of a life before grief. The girl stirred near the fire, her presence a fragile thread woven into the fabric of his solitude. He thought of the war, the battles fought not just with guns but with hope and fear. The wounds left behind were more than flesh deep. They lived in the silence between words, in the moments when pain had no outlet. Yet here, in this cabin, beneath the weight of snow and shadow, a fragile possibility flickered. The girl's eyes met his across the room, dark, searching, burdened by her own past. Without speaking, they shared the unspoken understanding of two souls marked by loss and survival. The weight of their histories pressed on them both, yet neither could turn away. For all the silence and sorrow, something new was beginning, a quiet hope born from the ashes of what once was. Sam's grip tightened on the journal, the past still heavy, but the future uncertain and fragile, waiting just beyond the door. The afternoon light slanted through the dusty cabin windows, casting long streaks across the floorboards. The girl sat near the hearth, fingers deftly weaving strips of leather into a small pouch, each movement purposeful and practiced. Sam watched quietly from his chair, the silence between them filled with things left unsaid. Names never spoken, promises broken long before either had arrived here. Her eyes, dark and steady, met his briefly before returning to her work. There was a history in her gaze, a deep well of pain that neither time nor distance had managed to soothe. Sam thought of the bloodlines tangled in forgotten treaties, of families torn apart by war and greed, of a world where belonging was a fragile, contested thing. He wanted to ask her name, to bridge the distance with something simple and human, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he reached for a worn photograph tucked beneath a loose floorboard, a faded image of Marjorie smiling softly, a reminder of love lost and dreams deferred. The girl glanced up again, catching his look, and for a moment, the weight of their shared solitude hung between them like a fragile thread. She spoke then, voice low and steady, a name that rolled off her tongue like a prayer. Nahili. Sam repeated it quietly, tasting the syllables, letting them settle in the space between them. It was a name heavy with history and hope, a fragile thread tying her to a past she had fled but could not forget. Broken promises lingered in the air, the vows made and shattered by those who claimed land and lives, the silent treaties that bound them all in chains of sorrow. Sam felt the pull of those ghosts, the tangled web of duty and defiance that Nahili carried with her. He understood, without asking, that her flight was not just from men but from a legacy of pain. In the quiet cabin, amid the crackling fire and gathering shadows, two lost souls began to name their own stories, spoken and unspoken, finding in each other a fragile refuge from the broken promises of the past. The days passed in quiet rhythm, marked by the slow settling of snow and the steady crackle of the fire. Nahili moved through the cabin like a shadow, present but elusive, her eyes always alert, her voice almost never heard. Sam watched her carefully, noting the way she avoided questions, how she folded herself into silence as if it were a shield against the world. She spoke only when necessary, her broken English shaped by careful restraint. The few words she offered were clipped and cautious, like footsteps on fragile ice. Sam wanted to reach through the walls she built, to draw out the stories hidden beneath her stillness. But the stranger who had arrived in his life held her secrets tightly. Her gaze often drifted toward the windows, watching the prairie stretch wide and empty, as if waiting for something or someone that might never come. Sam tried to read the unspoken language in her eyes, the fear, the resolve, the burden of a past too heavy to carry aloud. She was not just a visitor in his home. She was a survivor navigating the shadows of her own story. At night, when the wind howled and the cabin grew still, Nahili's silence became almost deafening. Sam would sit nearby, his thoughts drifting to the battles and losses etched into his own memory, wondering if she, too, carried scars deeper than any wound. He longed to offer comfort, but words felt clumsy, inadequate for the weight she bore. One evening, she reached for a worn leather-bound book Sam had left by the fire, a tattered journal filled with sketches and notes from his past. Her fingers traced the pages with delicate care, lingering on a sketch of a wild horse. For a moment, she looked up, meeting his eyes with something close to trust, then returned to her quiet retreat. The stranger who would not speak had come to Sam's door wounded and weary. Though her lips remained sealed, a quiet understanding was growing between them, one built not on words, but on shared silence and a fragile hope that healing might come in time. The days grew shorter and colder, the wind biting sharper against the cabin walls. Outside, the prairie seemed to hold its breath beneath a heavy, darkening sky. Sam noticed the shift, the way the birds fell silent, how even the rabbits vanished beneath the brush. The land itself felt uneasy, as if warning of a storm gathering far beyond the weather. Nahili moved with quiet purpose, her hands steady as she prepared the cabin for the coming cold. She repaired worn leather straps, tended the fire with care, and kept watch over the small stock of food. Yet beneath her calm exterior, Sam sensed a tension that ran deeper, an alertness born not just from the rising wind, but from something unseen closing in. One evening, as the sun dipped below the ridge in a wash of bruised purple and red, the first rumble came, not from the sky, but from the earth itself. The distant pounding of hooves echoed faintly, a slow, rhythmic thunder that sent a shiver through the bones of the land. Sam's gaze lifted to the horizon, eyes narrowing against the cold and fading light. He set down his tools and moved to the doorway, his breath steady despite the chill. Nahili stood beside him, her dark eyes scanning the same distant line where dust rose and shadows shifted. Neither spoke. Words felt useless against the weight of what was coming. The wind whipped around them, tugging at coats and scattering loose snowflakes. The storm was not just in the sky. It was in the ground, in the air, in the heavy silence that stretched between them. Sam's hand instinctively moved to the rifle leaning nearby, but he didn't take it up. This was no ordinary battle. It was a reckoning born of old wounds and promises broken long ago. As the thunder of hooves grew louder, Sam felt a fierce resolve rise within him. Whatever the coming storm, he would face it, not as a man running from his past, but as a man who had found a reason to stand and to protect the fragile life beside him. The prairie held its breath, waiting for the tempest to break. The morning dawned pale and still, the world outside glazed in frost and silent beneath a slate-gray sky. Sam stepped onto the porch, his boots crunching softly against the hardened snow. His eyes scanned the ground, searching for any sign of movement or life beyond the quiet. That's when he saw them. Fresh hoofprints pressed deep into the snow, a wide circle tracing around the cabin like a noose tightening slowly. He knelt to examine the tracks closely. They were numerous, dozens of horses, their prints overlapping and weaving, marking the ground with deliberate intent. The pattern was unmistakable, a ring meant to encircle, to contain, to warn. Sam's breath caught in his chest, cold air mingling with a growing sense of unease. Nahili joined him silently, her eyes sharp and steady as she crouched beside him. She traced the edges of the tracks with a gloved finger, lips pressing into a thin line. The signs were clear to her in a way they could never be to Sam. The horses were close, too close, and they weren't just passing through. Together, they stood and looked toward the ridge beyond the field where the earth blurred into sky. Their silhouettes moved, riders mounted on horses, their forms blurred by distance but unmistakable in purpose. Faces painted, weapons carried not in haste, but with the cold calculation of those who came to claim or confront. Sam's hand hovered near the rifle by the door, but his gaze stayed fixed on the approaching figures. There was no anger in the rider's advance, no call to battle, only a silent assertion, a message sent with the weight of many hooves and watching eyes. The circle of tracks tightened, the promise implicit in their pattern hanging heavy in the cold air. Nahili stood close, unflinching, a quiet fire burning behind her steady gaze. Sam felt the gravity of the moment settle deep in his bones. Whatever came next, the boundary had been drawn, and they were standing within its lines, waiting, watching, ready. The horizon darkened with movement as the riders crested the ridge, their horses' hooves stirring up clouds of powdery snow. Sam watched from the porch, his breath steady despite the surge of tension tightening his chest. 70 warriors, mounted and silent, rode in formation that spoke of discipline and purpose. Their faces were painted in fierce streaks of red and black, eyes sharp and unyielding beneath heavy brows. At their center sat a man whose presence commanded the wind itself. Cloaked in black wool fur that whipped like wings in the rising breeze, he carried the weight of a leader's authority with quiet certainty. Feathers braided into his horse's mane and tail marked him as no ordinary warrior, but one whose bloodline and power ran deep in the land. His gaze swept over the cabin, finally resting on Sam and the woman beside him. The riders slowed as they approached, forming a wide circle that encompassed the cabin without drawing weapons or making a sound. The ground beneath the horses' hooves was churned to mud, a stark contrast to the pristine snow beyond. The only sound was the soft panting of horses and the crunch of hooves pressing into the earth. Nahili stepped forward from the cabin's shadow, her posture straight and unflinching despite the storm gathering in the eyes that watched her. She spoke a single word, low and clear, a name that hung in the cold air like a summons. The leader said nothing, but his gaze lingered, dark and unreadable. Sam stood beside her, arms relaxed but ready, shoulders squared against the chill. The tension was palpable, a fragile thread stretched taut between two worlds. The warriors made no move to close the distance, their silence carrying more weight than any battle cry. This was a moment of reckoning, where history and bloodlines converged beneath a winter sky. The circle held firm, a living barrier between past and present, claim and choice. Inside, Sam and Nahili faced what was coming with quiet resolve, knowing that the true test was only just beginning. The warrior at the center of the circle dismounted with deliberate calm, the snow crunching beneath his boots as he stepped forward. His eyes, dark and ancient, held the weight of countless winters and untold stories. He moved with the quiet authority of a man used to commanding not just men, but the very land beneath their feet. His gaze settled first on Nahili, sharp and searching. For a long moment, he said nothing, letting the silence stretch heavy between them like the winter air. Then his eyes shifted slowly to Sam, measuring the man who had sheltered his daughter beneath this roof. There was no anger in the look, no hatred, only the steady scrutiny of a father weighing what was done against what must be. Nahili stood tall beside Sam, her jaw set with quiet determination. She met her father's gaze without flinching, though the tension in the air was almost tangible. The circle of warriors behind him remained motionless, silent witnesses to the unspoken reckoning. The father's face was carved from lines of history and hardship, streaked with paint that ran like war tears down his cheeks. His eyes held storms, memories of battles fought, promises broken, and bonds tested by time. He took a slow step closer, the snow shifting beneath him, and for a heartbeat, The distance between past and present felt impossibly small. His voice, when it came, was low and steady, a rumble that seemed to resonate with the earth itself. He spoke not as a judge, but as a man caught between duty and loss. His words carried a weight beyond their sound, a challenge and a plea wrapped in one. Sam met the father's gaze without looking away, arms loose but ready, the scars of his own past etched in every line of his face. Between them stood Nahili, no longer a child, but not yet free, and the fragile truce that held the circle in place was as delicate as the frost on the prairie grass. In that long moment of stillness, a silent understanding passed between three souls bound by blood, love, and the harsh truths of survival. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut, yet neither man made a move beyond measured steps. The Comanche chief's gaze lingered on Sam, searching beneath the surface for the truth behind the man who had opened his door and sheltered his daughter. Sam stood steady, arms relaxed but alert, his eyes unflinching beneath the weight of judgment. Nahili remained between them, a living bridge spanning two worlds tangled in history and pain. She spoke softly, her voice carrying a firmness that silenced the murmurs among the warriors. "I choose not to return," she said, words clear and deliberate. The declaration hung heavy in the cold air, a quiet defiance wrapped in courage. The chief's face remained inscrutable, the lines of age and battle etched deep into his skin. His hand rose slowly, not in threat, but in a gesture of recognition, as if weighing the strength of the woman who stood before him. His voice was low, a rumble that carried both warning and reluctant respect. "You sheltered her. That is a burden." Sam nodded, acknowledging the gravity without argument. The circle of warriors shifted subtly, but made no move to close in. The standoff held, not a battle, but a fragile agreement forged in silence and respect. The chief's eyes flicked toward Nahili once more, a mixture of pride and pain etched in their depths. She met his look without hesitation, standing firm in her choice despite the cost. The cold wind whispered through the clearing, stirring loose snowflakes that drifted like memories between the men. The past weighed heavily on all of them, but for this moment, it was held at bay by a truce neither fully trusted. Sam's hand moved instinctively toward the rifle leaning by the door, but stayed still. The fight to come would not be won by bullets or force, but by understanding and strength that ran deeper than the bloodlines that divided them. In the quiet tension of that winter morning, an uneasy truce was sealed, one born not of peace, but of necessity. The hours that followed passed in a fragile calm, the kind that settles after a storm's roar has quieted, but before the sky has fully cleared. Inside the cabin, Sam and Nahili moved through routines that spoke louder than words, tending the fire, mending worn leather, sharing sparse meals. Their silence was not emptiness but a bridge, a language formed from glances, gestures, and the unspoken understanding of two lives caught between worlds. Nahili braided strips of leather into delicate patterns, fingers steady and sure despite the faint tremor beneath the surface. Sam watched, the quiet rhythm of her work weaving a connection he could not yet name. Each knot, each twist was more than craft. It was a conversation without sound, a story told in the language of hands. Outside, the wind hummed low, carrying the scent of pine and cold earth. The prairie stretched vast and unyielding, a silent witness to the delicate negotiations happening beneath its wide sky. The divide between Sam's world and Nahili's was wide, shaped by history and loss, but in these small moments, it grew smaller. They shared no grand speeches or declarations, only the quiet presence of two souls learning to coexist. Sam showed her how to fashion rain straps from rawhide, his rough hands guiding hers with patient care. In return, Nahili taught him the subtle art of tracking, reading the snow's whisper like a book written by creatures unseen. At night, the fire's glow softened the edges of their difference, drawing shadows that danced like ghosts on the walls. Nahili sang once, a low, haunting lullaby in Comanche, the notes weaving through the air like smoke and wind. Sam listened without understanding the words, but feeling their weight. A lament for loss, a prayer for hope. In the silent language between them, words were unnecessary. Trust was built in touch, in shared tasks, in the quiet space where two worlds met, not in confrontation, but in fragile harmony. The storm outside might still rage, but inside, something new was beginning. A dialogue spoken without speaking, a bond forged beyond language. Nahili sat by the fire, her hands moving with practiced grace as she carved thin strips of bone into delicate shapes. The small workshop she had fashioned on the rough wooden table was filled with leather scraps, bits of sinew, and carved pieces waiting to become something more. Each movement was deliberate, a quiet ritual that seemed to calm the restless storm inside her. Sam watched her from across the room, the flickering firelight casting shadows on her focused face. He didn't ask about the stories behind her work. Some things were meant to be discovered in time, not forced from silence. The pieces she created, necklaces, small charms, and braided leather cords, were more than adornments. They were secrets wrapped in leather and bone, symbols of identity, protection, and the ties that bound her to a past still alive beneath the surface. She selected a thin leather thong, threading it carefully through a carved bone bead shaped like a wolf's tooth. The gesture spoke of strength and resilience, of a spirit unbroken by the harshness she had endured. As she worked, Nahili hummed softly, the tune unfamiliar but filled with an ancient rhythm, a song carried through generations. Sam reached in his pocket and pulled out a small bundle, 3 carved bone beads strung on leather, worn smooth by time. He placed them gently on the table beside her, a silent offering. Her eyes flicked to the gift, a flicker of gratitude softening the guarded lines of her face. Without a word, she took the beads and began weaving them into a new piece, blending old traditions with the fresh hope of something yet to come. The air between them was charged, not with words, but with the exchange of trust and respect, the shared understanding that healing could take many forms. Outside, the wind pressed against the cabin walls, but inside, the quiet clatter of tools and soft melody wove a different kind of storm, one made of secrets and stories told not in voices, but in the careful craft of hands shaping bone and leather into meaning. The morning sun filtered through the cabin window, casting warm beams across the worn wooden floor. Sam and Nahili moved through the day in gentle rhythms, their actions speaking louder than any words exchanged. There was a quietness between them now, a fragile trust built from shared moments rather than spoken promises. Nahili prepared a simple meal, the scent of simmering beans and wild onions filling the small space. Sam watched her work, noting how her hands moved with care, each gesture measured and purposeful. She didn't ask questions about the past, nor did she offer details of the journey that had brought her here. Instead, she offered small acts, folding blankets, gathering firewood, tending the animals, that stitched their lives together like an unseen thread. Sam responded in kind, repairing broken fence posts and oiling worn tools, his rough hands steady and sure. When he handed her a length of leather to craft into reins, their fingers brushed briefly, a touch light but charged with meaning. Neither flinched, neither pulled away. Outside, the wind whispered through the prairie grass, carrying the scent of pine and cold earth. Inside, the cabin was filled with the warmth of fire and quiet companionship. They shared glances that held more than the surface, acknowledgments of survival, resilience, and the tentative hope of new beginnings. At night, Sam found himself sitting closer to the fire, the chair angled toward where Nahili worked on her beadwork. She hummed softly, the melody weaving through the room like smoke. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Their silence was comfortable, a space where words were unnecessary and trust grew in the quiet exchange of presence. In these small, unspoken moments, the barriers between them softened. The weight of past wounds lifted slightly, replaced by a shared strength forged not in grand declarations, but in the steady, quiet acts that said, without saying, I am here. I will stay. The fire crackled warmly in the hearth, sending flickering shadows dancing across the cabin walls. Sam and Nahili sat near the glow, the night stretching deep and still around them. Outside, the prairie was blanketed in snow, silent beneath a sky heavy with stars. Inside, the warmth of the flames wove a fragile cocoon against the cold world beyond. Nahili traced patterns in the worn leather of her lap, her voice rising softly in a language Sam did not understand. The words were strange and beautiful, carrying the rhythm of ancient stories, tales of wind and water, of earth and spirit. Her eyes glimmered with memory as she sang, the melody a thread connecting past and present, pain and hope. Sam listened quietly, feeling the weight and grace of the stories without knowing their meaning. The firelight caught the lines of his weathered face, the scars etched deep beneath his skin, and he thought of the battles he had fought, not just with guns, but with loss and loneliness. Nahili's song was a balm, a bridge between two worlds scarred by silence. As the flames licked higher, Sam began to share fragments of his own past. His voice was low, roughened by disuse but steady. He spoke of a daughter he never held, a wife buried beneath the leaning cottonwood, and the long years spent carrying grief like a shadow. Nahili's dark eyes held his, absorbing the weight of his words with quiet understanding. Between the songs and stories, the firelight flickered, sometimes soft and tender, sometimes fierce and wild. In those moments, the cabin became more than shelter. It was a place where wounds could be named, where history could be faced and maybe, just maybe, healed. The night deepened, but the warmth lingered, wrapping them both in its quiet embrace. Through the language of firelight and song, two souls began to find a common rhythm, a shared story told not just in words, but in the heartbeats that echoed in the flickering glow. The morning air was sharp and cold, the sky a clear blue that stretched endlessly over the frost-covered prairie. Sam stood by the cabin, watching as the distant ridge caught the early sunlight. The weight of what lay ahead settled heavy in his chest, an unspoken challenge that went beyond words or weapons. The Comanche chief returned that day, riding with quiet purpose. His cloak of black wolf fur caught the wind, a symbol of authority and ancient strength. He dismounted smoothly, his eyes steady as they met Sam's. There was no malice there, only a test, a measure of honor and resolve that reached back through generations of blood and history. "You will hunt with me," the chief said simply, his voice low and unwavering. "One deer, one path. If you walk it without flinching, I will know what kind of man you are." Sam felt the weight of the challenge settle over him like a mantle. This was more than a test of skill. It was a trial of character, a way to prove whether he could carry the burden of trust and respect between their worlds. They rode together into the rolling hills where sagebrush whispered beneath the cold wind. The hunt was silent, marked by patient tracking and careful footsteps. Sam moved with the steady precision of a man who had once been a medic, who had learned to read the land as well as the pain it hid. When the buck appeared, a strong, alert creature with keen eyes, Sam drew the bow with a calm breath. The arrow flew true, striking just behind the shoulder. The moment was heavy with significance, a connection forged in respect and understanding. Returning to the camp, the chief's gaze held a new depth, a silent acknowledgement of Sam's strength beyond words. "You do not speak like us," he said, "but your actions say what your mouth does not." The test was passed, but more than that, a bridge had been built, one of blood and honor, of respect earned through courage and quiet determination. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, Sam felt he was not alone in walking it. The morning sun was pale as Sam and the chief rode silently into the hills, their horses' hooves muffled by the soft earth beneath scattered sagebrush. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and cold stone. Sam's hands gripped the bow with a mixture of familiarity and unfamiliar weight, the weight of a trial he had not sought but could not refuse. They moved as one through the landscape, the chief's eyes sharp and unyielding, guiding Sam in silence. Every step was deliberate, every sound measured. The hunt was not just for game. It was a test woven from generations of tradition, a silent judgment on the kind of man Sam was. Hours passed beneath the vast sky, their breath clouding in the cold air. The land was both friend and foe, offering no easy path, no mercy. Sam felt the quiet pull of memory, the battles fought, the lives lost, the wounds carried beyond the flesh. This hunt was different. It was not about survival alone, but about proving something deeper, his worth, his honor, his place in a world divided. Then the buck appeared, a magnificent creature, alert and graceful, its eyes reflecting the cold light of dawn. Time seemed to slow as Sam raised the bow, the arrow poised like a promise. His breath steadied, the world narrowing to a single point of focus. The shot flew true, striking clean behind the shoulder. As the animal fell, the chief's gaze met Sam's, steady and unreadable. No words were needed. The hunt was complete, not just a test of skill, but a rite of passage, a silent verdict passed beneath the endless sky. They returned to camp with the deer, the journey heavy with unspoken meaning. The chief dismounted, his voice low and deliberate. "You carry the weight well," he said. "Actions speak louder than words." In that moment, Sam felt a shift, not just in how he was seen, but in how he saw himself. The hunt had tested more than his aim. It had tested his courage, his honor, and the strength to walk a path that bridged two worlds. The sun dipped low behind the distant hills as Sam and Nahili returned to the cabin, the weight of the day settling over them like a quiet storm. The hunt had been more than a test. It was a turning point, a breaking of invisible chains forged long before either of them had arrived on this land. Inside, the fire burned steady, casting warm light over worn walls and familiar shadows. Nahili moved with a new calm, her hands steady as she began to braid fresh strands into her hair. Sam watched quietly, sensing a shift, not just in her, but in the space between them. The past, with its heavy burdens and broken promises, had clung tightly to their lives. But now, something was loosening, a thread unraveling from the tapestry of pain that had bound them both. The chief's challenge had been more than a measure of strength. It was a call to reclaim agency, to choose a path beyond fear and expectation. Nahili spoke softly that evening, her voice carrying the weight of unspoken stories. She told of bloodlines stretched thin by conflict, of vows made and broken, and of a future she was determined to claim for herself, not as a daughter bound by tradition, but as a woman forging her own way. Sam listened, his own history folding into hers like pieces of a larger puzzle. He shared fragments of loss and hope, the quiet courage it took to break free from chains invisible but no less real. Together, they faced the fragile possibility of healing, not by forgetting, but by embracing the truths that shaped them. The cabin, once a refuge from grief, now felt like a place of transformation. Here, in the flickering firelight, old wounds could begin to close and new bonds could form. The night stretched deep and still, but within its quiet heart, Sam and Nahili stood on the edge of change. The chains of the past were not yet fully broken, but the first links had fallen away, leaving space for freedom, for choice, and for a future built on strength and trust. The evening settled quietly over the cabin, the firelight soft and steady against the gathering dark. Sam and Nahili sat close, but not touching, the space between them filled with a gentle calm that neither had known in a long time. Words felt unnecessary here. Their silence had grown into something powerful, a bond forged not in speech, but in presence. Outside, the wind whispered through the tall prairie grass, carrying the faint scent of pine and cold earth. Inside, the crackling fire offered warmth, its glow flickering across their faces and softening the hard edges left by grief and struggle. Nahili's eyes reflected the flames, steady and thoughtful, while Sam's gaze held a quiet acceptance, a recognition that some things needed no explanation. In the stillness, the unspoken passed between them like a language all their own. Trust blossomed in the spaces between breaths, understanding woven in the pauses where words might have faltered. The heavy weight of the past seemed to lift, if only for a moment, replaced by the gentle strength of shared silence. Sam found comfort in the steady rhythm of Nahili's breathing, the soft rise and fall beside him. It was a reminder that connection didn't always come wrapped in grand declarations or stories told aloud. It could be found in the simple act of being there, unguarded and present. Nahili reached out slowly, her hand resting lightly on Sam's arm, a touch that spoke of newfound trust and fragile hope. He didn't pull away. Instead, he turned to meet her gaze, the quiet understanding between them deepening. The night stretched on, wrapped in the gentle embrace of silence and firelight. In that space, two souls marked by loss and courage found a refuge, a place where silence was not emptiness, but the beginning of something real. When words failed, their bond held strong, a testament to the healing power of simply being together without need for more. The first light of dawn broke slowly over the horizon, softening the sharp edges of night with gentle hues of pink and gold. Outside, the prairie was quiet, the snow glistening beneath a sky that promised calm after the storm. Sam stood on the porch, the chill morning air filling his lungs as he watched the world begin to stir. The weight of the past weeks lingered like a fading shadow, but the heavy clouds that had loomed over them were finally lifting. The fierce winds that had battered the cabin and tested their resolve had passed, leaving behind a stillness that felt both fragile and full of promise. Nahili joined him silently, her footsteps soft in the fresh snow. She wore a shawl stitched with new patterns, a blend of old traditions and fresh beginnings. Her eyes reflected the dawn's light, clear, steady, and filled with a quiet hope. They stood side by side, looking out over the land that had witnessed their trials and growth. The silence between them was no longer heavy, but comforting, a shared peace forged through struggle and understanding. The storms, both outside and within, had shaped them, but had not broken them. Sam's hand found hers, fingers intertwining with a gentle certainty. In that simple touch was a promise, a vow not spoken aloud, but felt deeply. Together, they faced the new day, ready to build a life woven from the threads of their past and the possibilities of what lay ahead. The sun climbed higher, casting warm light over the frost-kissed grass and the cabin's sturdy walls. Birds began to sing, filling the air with songs of renewal and life. The land breathed, and so did they, two souls once fractured, now slowly mending beneath the vast, open sky. As the dawn rose fully, it carried with it the quiet truth that storms pass, and with them come new beginnings. For Sam and Nahili, the rising sun marked not just a new day, but a future rooted in hope and the strength found only after weathering the fiercest of storms. Nahili moved through the cabin with a newfound steadiness, her every step a quiet assertion of the choice she had made. The weight of expectation, old laws and bloodlines, had pressed hard against her spirit, but now she carried herself with the strength of a woman who had claimed her own path. Outside, the prairie stretched wide and open, a vast expanse of possibility beneath the clear blue sky. Nahili paused by the window, her gaze drifting to the horizon where land met sky, as if seeing beyond the borders that once defined her. She wrapped the shawl tighter around her shoulders, a symbol not just of heritage but of renewal. Her decision was clear. Freedom was not simply the absence of chains, but the courage to walk forward on her own terms. She had left behind the shadow of ownership, of being claimed by a lineage that saw her as property rather than person. Here, with Sam, she had found a place where her voice could be her own, where her spirit could breathe. Sam watched her with quiet respect, understanding that her choice was more than rebellion. It was survival, identity, and hope intertwined. He never pressured her, never asked for more than she was willing to give. In his eyes, she was not defined by the past, but by the strength she carried within. The cabin, once a refuge from the storm, had become a home where Nahili could rebuild herself, piece by piece. She carved new stories into bone and leather, wove old songs with fresh melodies, and stitched together the fragments of her life into something whole and resilient. Each day, she stepped further into her freedom, not as an act of defiance, but as a quiet declaration. The woman who chose freedom was not running from her past, but embracing her future, a future where she was no longer bound by the expectations of others, but guided by the steady compass of her own heart. And as the sun climbed higher, casting light over the open plains, Nahili stood tall, a woman reborn in the quiet strength of choice and the unyielding power of freedom. The town's dusty streets were quiet as Sam and Nahili rode in, their horses' hooves stirring soft clouds beneath a hot sun. Eyes turned at their arrival. Whispers followed them like shadows. The townsfolk's gazes were sharp, flickering between curiosity and judgment. Nahili, wrapped in her shawl, sat tall in the saddle, her expression calm but resolute. At the general store, Miss Lahi stood with arms crossed, her lips pressed tight. Her eyes flicked first to Nahili, then to Sam, weighing the unfamiliar against the comfortable rhythms of the town. The air was thick with unspoken questions and the heavy weight of old prejudices that refused to fade. Sam dismounted slowly, steady under the weight of scrutiny. He kept his chin high, hands loose at his sides, refusing to shrink beneath the cold stares. Nahili stepped down beside him, her voice clear and steady as she spoke, not to explain, but to declare, "I'm not an arrangement. I am a woman who chose." A hush spread through the small crowd. Some faces tightened, others softened with reluctant respect, but no one challenged her words aloud. Sam moved forward, gathering supplies with quiet determination, each act a silent defiance against the whispered judgments. Inside the store, the scent of dust and cinnamon mingled with the tension. As Miss Lahi rang up their goods, her fingers paused briefly over the items, then continued with practiced care. The townsfolk whispered behind their hands, the lines of suspicion etched deep. Before leaving, Sam's voice broke the silence with quiet resolve. "We will be married come spring." The words hung heavy, clear enough for every ear to catch. A murmur rippled through the room, some disapproval, some surprise, but mostly the weight of change settling in. Nahili did not flinch. She turned and walked out, the faint scent of sage trailing behind her like a quiet declaration of strength. Outside, Sam exhaled, not in relief, but in readiness. The judgment had come, but so had their resolve. Together, they faced the town's scrutiny, knowing that the road ahead was uncertain, but bound by a choice made with courage and love. The sun dipped low, casting long amber rays across the prairie that stretched endless beneath the wide sky. Sam stood by the barn, a worn bucket in one hand, the reins slung over his shoulder. His coat was patched and speckled with hay, but his posture held something new, less burdened, more rooted, as if the weight of past grief had softened in his steady strength. Inside the cabin, Nahili moved with quiet grace, her bare feet light against the wooden floor. Her hair was braided down her back, a single dark rope that spoke of tradition and resilience. The shawl she wore was no longer the old one Marjorie had left behind, but a new creation, stitched with fresh edges and a strip of blue cloth from town, woven with care and purpose. It was a symbol of life reclaimed, a tapestry of past and future intertwined. Sam's eyes followed her across the room, watching as she spread a blanket to dry by the firelight. In his hands, he held a small bundle, a necklace of carved bone beads strung on leather, worn smooth by time. He placed it gently on the table where Nahili would find it, a silent gift that said, "I see you, I choose you." The days that followed moved in steady rhythm, mending fences, carving bone, weaving leather, and sharing quiet moments that needed no words. Their bond grew not from grand gestures, but from the simple acts of care and presence. The town's judgment softened, some neighbors offering tentative smiles and small kindnesses, while others remained distant, But the couple faced it all together, unshaken. One evening, Sam sat by the fire with a cradle resting in his lap, carving slowly and carefully, as he had once done for a child never born. Nahili stood watching, her hands resting lightly on her belly, already rounded with new life, a future blooming quietly within her. The fire crackled and the prairie night stretched wide and deep, but inside the cabin, two souls once broken were now woven together, rooted in fire and promise, building a life not of rescue or conquest, but of love and choice.